Okay, so here we are again, my friends. Last time, to review, right, I shared with you two propositions that inform how I think about history and politics. One is about the basic oneness and equality of humanity, and the other is about the emergence of a global civilization. And then I started to lay out a case for why I think it's time for a reassessment of South Carolina's past in a way that will help us to face responsibility, that will help us to face responsibly the existential crisis that we find before us today, and be part of solutions in our own communities, for the country and for the world. And in this light, we did an analysis of some of the thinking behind the standard synthesis of South Carolina history by Walter Edgar. Specifically, his statement that while the state had almost unparalleled importance in the national narrative up to and including the Civil War, after Reconstruction, and certainly after World War II, South Carolina slipped out of the national consciousness. All this is coming back to you, right? Quite significantly, this seems to imply a relatively minor role for the civil rights movement and for South Carolina's place in it. And we put all of this in the context of the immediate post-Cold War idea of the end of history, or this natural triumph of capitalism and democracy, what the Yale historian Tim Snyder has more recently termed the politics of inevitability. But what we can say much more confidently now, when many Americans and people in lots of countries are in the grip of the politics of eternity that depends on manipulating our fears and emotions, is that we ignore history and our responsibility to act to shape a better future to our peril. The two relatively recent events that we used to highlight this point were the Charleston Massacre of June 2015 and the coup attempt at the US Capitol of January 2021. And we looked at two examples, the documentary Reconstruction America After the Civil War and the 1619 Project, of how moving the marginalized, particularly Black people, to the center of our analysis is a key to freeing us from the politics of inevitability and the politics of eternity. Basically, what I was arguing is that this change in perspective gives us the ammunition to be able to say to the practitioners of eternity, look, progress really is possible. People can be good and do good. Government can exist to be a force for improving society. And at the end of the day, there's really no us and them, there's only us. And we can say to the practitioners of inevitability, progress does not happen by itself. You have to take responsibility for improving the world in whatever situation you find yourself. Of course, there are always setbacks, but making this effort to improve the world does make a difference, and it's really at the heart of what it means to be a human being. Okay, with all of this said, what we're going to do today is to look more closely at how we might reconsider some of our assumptions about South Carolina's history as a way of fitting ourselves to build the future. What we might see more clearly if we shift our perspective, or if we shake up our periodization, or even, I know this sounds kind of crazy, even if we center the ideas and actions and experiences of the majority of the population of South Carolina instead of a small minority. To do this, I want to introduce you to two new pieces of scholarship, even newer than the ones we discussed last time, that I think can help us with this reassessment of South Carolina's place in the United States and in the world, and help orient us to the tasks at hand. And these are the two pieces of scholarship: Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War, by Howard French, who is a former journalist and a professor at Columbia University, published in 2021. And To Govern the Globe, World Orders and Catastrophic Change, which was also published in 2021 by Alfred McCoy, who's a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I would love to have a whole class, a whole semester just about these two books. That is not what we're going to do today. Let me just tell you very briefly that they overlap a great deal in terms of their subject and in terms of their chronology. And neither one of them has to do with South Carolina in particular, but I think if you put them together, they can open up new vistas for helping to situate ourselves in the world. And they're both trying to make sense of the big picture driving forces that have been shaping the world for the past 500-600 years since all the continents came into regular contact with each other. But they do this from different complementary vantage points. So French's purpose is to show the ways in which Africa and African people have been central to the birth and development of the modern world. Not just objects to be acted upon or exploited, but actors. He does this in at least three main ways. First, he upends our understanding of the origins of the so-called Age of Discovery in Europe, locating it first in the encounter with Africa, not Asia, like all of us were taught in elementary school. Second, French recounts the development of the foundational social and economic institution of the modern world, the sugar plantation, which he provocatively, but I think entirely accurately terms the prison industrial labor camp, and how this model spread to Brazil and the Caribbean, and then to the Carolina colony on the North American mainland, and from here, with the invention of the cotton gin, how the plantation model spread across the Deep South to form the very basis of the Industrial Revolution. Not just the Industrial Revolution in the United States, but in Europe as well. And third, French brings together the strands of black resistance to slavery and empire, from the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th century to the Great Migration from the southern US in the first half of the 20th century, showing how black people on both sides of the Atlantic, not just in the United States, have consistently fought for a world of equality and self-determination and human rights. Now, Africa and Africans are central to McCoy's analysis as well, but his focus is different. He is thinking about a conceptual and chronological framework so that we can see better how the main questions that arise once the different parts of the world are connected to each other 500-600 years ago. These main questions that arise, who counts as a human being? What are the rights of human beings? How do we bring order to relations between states and peoples, large and small, in this new world that is coming into being? How these overarching questions are dealt with in successive stages over time, stages that he calls world orders. So briefly, as McCoy describes it, a world order is a system of assumptions, arrangements, norms that a powerful empire puts in place, not just for themselves, but in theory for everybody, to deal with these fundamental questions of human rights and state sovereignty. So an empire imposes a world order, but the world order is bigger than the empire. And to some degree, it lives on even after that empire has lost its power. I'll explain this some more. So McCoy says that we've had 3 world orders so far. The first was the Iberian world order that started with the Portuguese and Spanish voyages of discovery in the 1400s. And then came the British World Order, which started in earnest with the Congress of Vienna in 1815. And most recently is the American World Order, or the Washington World Order, which started at the end of World War II and continues to today. Although the current health and future prospects of this Washington World Order is a big open question that McCoy ends his book with. And I should point out that this book went to press early in the Biden administration and right before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the revival and expansion of NATO. So stay tuned for how does the Washington World Order turn out. Go ahead. Yes, please.
Just pointing out a little observation. It seems like just pointing out a little observation. It seems like the age of these world orders isn't getting any older. They aren't lasting so long. It's like each one is getting shorter and shorter and shorter.
That's a very, very good point. Yes, the Iberian world order is 300 years. The British imperial age is 100 and change, right? And the American so far is 75, 80 years, and we shall see, right? Let me explain some more. But that's a very astute observation, right? Why did this one take so long, and then why has there been so much change since then? Let's see. Okay. What?
It doesn't look like America's world order is going to last.
And McCoy's question is, in 2020, as he's finishing up this manuscript, right? McCoy's suggestion is the Washington World Order, is it essentially done? And what comes next? He suggests the possibility of a Chinese world order. But he says that one is not going to last long because climate change is going to undo any kind of world order by 2100. It's an absolutely fascinating book. Every page is worth it. And that last part, where he gets into the climate data and begins to speculate, educated speculation, it's very fascinating, totally provocative, and worth kind of wrestling with. We're just not going to talk about that part today. But yes, this is definitely a theory of change over time. And I need to address that. So he says that each one of these has been precipitated by a cataclysm. They don't just come out of nowhere. Each of them was associated with and facilitated by, to some degree, made possible by a new energy source. And he says that each one is more comprehensive than the last. People are actually learning something across this span of time. That is, each of these is touching directly the lives of an increasing share of the globe and its people. Now, he also argues, and this point is important to my two propositions from the beginning last time. He argues that each of these world orders built upon the last in attempting to deal with these fundamental questions about human rights and the relationships among states. In other words, what he's laying out is kind of successive stages of wrestling with the contradictions of a strong empire exercising power on one hand and professing high ideals on the other hand. He makes the case that in the long view, over these 5 or 6 centuries, there are actually improvements from one world order to the next in terms of human rights and human flourishing and international law. Now, McCoy is not arguing that all of this is a bed of roses. His first book was about the Vietnam conflict and the illegal drug trade through the U.S. military and the CIA from Southeast Asia. He's not one to let powerful empires off the hook. That's not where he's coming from, right? But he's saying if we zoom out, there is a difference, an objective difference between the way these initial Iberian empires dealt with questions of human rights and what we tried to do in the 20th and early 21st centuries. All right, just work with me here, all right? So we don't have time to talk about these world orders in much detail. But what I do want to do is to sort of present them to you in a very brief outline, intersperse them with some of the insights I've gained from Born in Blackness, the other book, and then sprinkle in comments about where does South Carolina's history fit in, especially as we keep Black people and these questions about race and human rights and governance at the center of our analysis. So obviously this is not an attempt to tell all of South Carolina's history even in the briefest of terms, but to repeat an analogy that I might have used last time, it's more like taking these two bright lamps, French's book and McCoy's book, and shining them each from their own vantage point on South Carolina's past to see what can we see more clearly with them than that might have been sort of in the shadows before. All right, so the first one is the Iberian world order. And the cataclysm that precipitated the Iberian world order was the Black Death that slashed the population of Europe, disrupted medieval society, and this was the context in which Portuguese rulers first tried to find a new sea route to the sources of African gold that undergirded the economy of both Christendom and the domains of Islam. The gold that had been on such lavish display during the visit of Mansa Musa, the ruler of Mali in 1324, and that French argues had fired the imagination of peoples on the other side of the Mediterranean. After a Spanish expedition that you may have heard of accidentally discovered the Americas in 1492, the Pope divided the world between the rulers of Spain and Portugal and gave them the right to conquer all the lands and seas in their respective domains and to enslave all the peoples they conquered unless they were Christians. And this brings us to the Iberian world order's principal sources of energy, right? One is wind power for sailing ships, and also in the form of windmills to turn machinery, particularly sugar mills. And two, massed, coerced human muscle power in the form of chattel slavery. And almost from the beginning of the abuses against the indigenous Americans and Africans, a few Spanish religious leaders began to denounce them as crimes, which McCoy argues is opening up this long process of political and intellectual struggle over this question of universal human rights and international law. Who is a human being? What are the rights of human beings? And how do different peoples and states interact with each other? There were rising competitors, especially England and the Netherlands, that further developed these ideas of religious freedom and individual political rights and international law, but really only for themselves. Because overseas, the Netherlands and Britain carried out the Iberian slave trade and abuses against colonized peoples to even greater degree. Of course, this is the world order in which South Carolina was founded. After a century and a half of the drastic decline of indigenous populations in the New World, primarily due to diseases from the Old World, and intense competition among Spain and France and the Netherlands and England, and people forget about this, but even Sweden for a minute, over control over North America. But the competition for North America only makes sense in the context of the real prize and the driving force of modernity, which is sugar from the Caribbean. And French really shines in his chapters about the rise and spread of the sugar plantation, this prison industrial labor complex. First on these islands of Madeira and Sao Tome off the coast of Africa, and then from there to Brazil that Portugal claimed, and then via the Dutch from Brazil to the little island of Barbados in the West Indies in the 1640s, and then there on Barbados, the English perfected the plantation model with brutal efficiency. and learned for themselves to be experts at dehumanizing Africans. And then from Barbados, the model spread further to other English colonies like Jamaica and Carolina, and then a little bit later to the French colony of Saint-Domingue on the island of Hispaniola. Yes, I saw your hand.
I just wanted to ask, how big were these, you mentioned the sugar plantations, how big were, at least on the islands, like how massive in size were these?
So French does a fantastic job bringing together a lot of scholarship, particularly about Barbados. And if I get to talking about this, then we'll be here for 3 days. But Barbados is really, really impressive. So we think about the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution as taking place in factories in England, right? Textile factories in England, so forth. All right, French makes the argument that it is sugar plantations on Barbados that are the real testing ground of industrialization. The regimentation of a large workforce, hundreds of people, vertical integration, that is, like all of the steps in the process are controlled by one business, right? So one plantation owner does everything from like growing the cuttings from last year, and the planting and the harvesting and the processing and all of and then there's the modern accounting that is developed on Barbados, right? To keep track of every shilling and every pence, I guess, right? That all of these are foundations for the Industrial Revolution. So it's really on Barbados that these become these integrated agricultural businesses, agricultural factories, right? Does that sort of answer it? I think that's his chapters about Barbados are arresting. And when he talks about the Drax family and the brutal efficiency of these pioneers on Barbados of the sugar business, and the way that they took the human body of the enslaved person and made it just another input into the factory, right? This is a critical piece in understanding the foundations of modern capitalism. Thank you for asking that. I have to stop because I'll just get too much into it. And I've studied Barbados before. I have been to Barbados before. And still, I read some stuff in French that was news to me. Okay. Y'all probably recall that most of the initial settlers of the Carolina colony were from Barbados, black and white, and some of the other Caribbean islands. And the Carolina colony was explicitly planned as a food pantry and sawmill for Barbados, because sugar production on Barbados was so lucrative that it did not make sense to use land there for anything other than sugar. Carolina was a part of what was called the Grand Design by the British government for a closed economy that would connect Britain, West African trading forts, the Caribbean sugar islands, and the mainland North American colonies. So you have seen maps like this before, like way back in, starting in the 3rd grade, of the triangle trade, right? In the Atlantic that connects Europe and West Africa and the Americas. But the point that I want to make is that it's not a triangle, it's a square. And trade between North America, mainland North America, and the West Indies is a critical piece of this political and economic design. French does a masterful job bringing together the best scholarship over the past couple decades to explain how the New World colonies, powered by enslaved Africans, led to Europe's economic and political rise, sometimes in ways that are very well documented. For example, the importance of sugar to the diets of industrial workers in Great Britain. And sometimes in ways that are surprising, at least for me, like the critical role of coffee shops. Coffee and tea and the sugar that you mix in them are all tropical drugs that are grown by slaves. The critical role of coffee shops and newspapers, which are first printed in Britain to be read and discussed in coffee shops while you are drinking these tropical drugs, right? The critical role of coffee shops and newspapers in the emergence of civil society. What are you talking about in the coffee shops that you're reading from? You're talking about politics in the coffee shops. These notions of civil society, individual political rights, and democracy. French quotes Abbé Raynal, this late 18th century French scholar, and this really stood out to me, how pivotal the place of the Caribbean is in Europe's rise. The labors of the colonists settled in these long-scorned islands are the sole basis of the African trade. Extend the fisheries and cultivation of North America. Provide advantageous outlets for the manufacture of Asia. Double, perhaps triple, the activity of the whole of Europe. They can be regarded as the principal cause of the rapid movement which stirs the universe. Of course, by the universe, Raynal is talking about Europe. The Africa trade that he talks about consists chiefly of extracting bound labor from the African continent, and the colonists that he's talking about in the West Indies are the enslaved Africans being worked literally to death on the sugar plantations. This is the cause of the movement that stirs the universe. There are so many threads that I would like to explore here, but I'll just mention a few. One has to do with the role of empire in creating the modern European state and notions of political rights and civil society. French argues that it's not because these Atlantic-facing European countries had strong states, strong governments, that they were able to venture outwards and establish empires, but precisely the other way around. It was competition among Europeans, incessant warfare for 400 years over control of Africa and of Africans, and for the tropical places in the Americas where their bodies could be put to the most productive use, that led to the emergence of the most successful European states. This is not the way I learned it, okay? French draws from this late American sociologist Charles Tilly, who noted that in order to compete for empires, rulers willy-nilly started activities and organizations that eventually took on a life of their own. Courts, treasuries, systems of taxation, regional administrations, public assemblies, and so forth. And as the powers of the state grew in order to prosecute empire, so did the claims of its own citizens, particularly those citizens who were most involved in overseas trade against the rulers. In other words, overseas merchants, slave traders, plantation owners asserted their own political rights and worked to protect themselves and their profits from the power of the monarch. And nowhere was this more true than in England, where the slave trade was at the core of the debates in the 17th and 18th century over whether the legitimacy of the state ought to come from the crown or from the people. One important participant in this kind of political debate was the philosopher John Locke, who famously argued that people are born free and equal, not subject to a king. That people have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. You've heard all this before. Free people give some of their rights to a government that will promote the public good so that everybody can better protect and enjoy their life, liberty, and property. And a government that fails to do that can be resisted and replaced with another government. The reason we know all of this is because John Locke's thought was so central to the ideas of the founders of the United States. Although Jefferson changed the phrase in the Declaration of Independence to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? It rolls off the tongue better. But what we don't remember as well is that Locke was also the lawyer who drafted the fundamental constitutions of Carolina in 1670. This governing document that was to provide for a landed aristocracy in South Carolina, that made citizenship rights dependent on owning land, that provided for slavery as the basis of the economic and social system. It should not be a surprise that a number of the 8 Lords Proprietors of Carolina had direct experience in or were investors in Caribbean sugar plantations. And Locke himself owned shares in the Company of Royal Adventurers into Africa, which was formed to muscle in on the Portuguese and Dutch business in Africa, and eventually became the biggest single slave trading organization ever. The point I'm trying to make here is that ideas of individual political rights, limiting the powers of the monarch, rule by consent of the governed, in other words, some of the founding ideas of South Carolina and eventually of the United States, were only meant for some European white men, and these ideas grew up in tandem with and were in some sense born out of New World empires of slavery and dehumanization. By the 1770s, South Carolina had become a prosperous part of the British Empire, not just by supplying lumber and foodstuffs to feed and house the enslaved laborers on Barbados, but also adopting wholesale the Barbadian plantation model for the production of indigo and then of rice. And because of the colony's economic success, virtually all white men were able to eventually meet the qualifications to vote and hold office, which meant that the colony's political culture had become remarkably democratic. The Commons House of Assembly was one of the hardest working colonial legislatures in British North America, with members paying their own expenses and usually staying in session longer than the law required. And if you didn't serve in the Commons House, then chances are you'd be appointed to one of the commissions which were formed to supervise public works projects like building bridges and maintaining roads and dredging the canals, or you might be elected to the vestry, which was the church body that doubled as local government in the colony. And wherever you were in the colony, you kept abreast of the news by reading the Gazette, the newspaper that was published in Charleston and distributed up and down the coast and into the interior of the colony. So you have, by the time of the American Revolution, a relatively participatory political system and political culture, yes, but for only a small fraction of the population. There was barely any discussion of rights for white women. And the majority of the people, enslaved Africans, were subject to a version of the slave code from Barbados that treated them not as people at all. Of course, the enslaved had their own sense of human rights and dignity, and they saw the brutality and hypocrisy of the society that the white colonists had created. They worked against all odds to build families and communities and to assert their humanity through art and culture and religion. This is a painting probably from just after the Revolution in the area around Beaufort, South Carolina. It is one of the earliest known non-stereotypical depictions of African Americans by themselves pursuing their own interest. You know, just like people. In this case, it's probably an African-derived dance that they're doing. You might notice, if you can see over here, it includes the earliest known depiction in America of the banjo, which is a West African musical instrument. Many of the enslaved in Carolina resisted, overtly and covertly, individually and collectively. And here we can mention the Stono Rebellion of 1739, the largest slave revolt in British North America. And in the Stono Rebellion, a large group of men, probably former soldiers from the Kingdom of Congo in West Central Africa, armed themselves and marched towards Spanish Florida, where the government had promised freedom to Africans who were fleeing from slavery in Carolina. They burned plantations and killed white people along the way, gathering more recruits until the slaveholders' militia beat them in 2 battles and executed most of the rest. And what had the fugitives' banner read in English, so there could be no mistaking it? Liberty. The Iberian world order, to draw this part to a close, lasted for about 300 years. And it came apart in a half century of revolutions, about 1775 to 1824 on both sides of the Atlantic. Here is a map that, that expresses some of the convulsions of this era. You have the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon's reactionary wars to restore empire across Europe and the Americas, the Islamic revolutions in Western Africa, and finally the Latin American wars of independence. And some of the most radical voices in these movements boldly proclaimed principles of human equality and challenged the very legitimacy of slavery and of empire, of course to varying degrees and results. In South Carolina and in the United States in general, we're gearing up to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, 1775 to 2025, right? And I hope that this anniversary will give us a chance to think afresh about the American Revolution in this wider context, as part of the breakup of the Iberian world order and a transition to something new. And I think there's no better occasion for us to think together soberly and critically about how much of a democracy the new United States really was. There are a number of issues that South Carolinians really need to explore about where we fit into this revolutionary age. I'll just say a couple more things. The main point I want to say about the American Revolution is that there's this tension between slavery and freedom, between ideals of democracy and equality on one hand, and beliefs in hierarchy and empire and force on the other hand. And as so many scholars have pointed out, and as people at the time pointed out, these are not little bugs in the system. These contradictions are the way the system grew up. They're inherent in the American Republic. Everybody in the Revolutionary Age perceived these contradictions. For example, in 1765, when white Charlestonians were shouting "Liberty, liberty" in the street to protest the Stamp Act, the enslaved black people shouted back "Liberty, liberty" to protest their literal enslavement, right? The revolutionary government of South Carolina resisted proposals to arm the enslaved for combat against the British because they feared what those black people might do with those weapons. In fact, black patriots were rare in South Carolina, but thousands of black people who had fought for the British and been promised their freedom, and thousands more who were still the property of white loyalists left with the British at the end of the war. In the years afterwards, South Carolina's new legislature, which included our own university's namesake, former Patriot General Francis Marion, worked overtime to rebuild the state's economy. And of course, that meant shoring up the institution of slavery. And no, by the way, the door's open, but I'm going to say it anyway. There is no evidence that Francis Marion ever contemplated granting freedom to one or more of his own slaves who fought with him for the duration of the Revolutionary War. As precarious as the state's economic position was, South Carolina's delegates to the Constitutional Convention made sure to extract guarantees for the protection of slavery, including the 3/5 clause, which greatly inflated the slaveholders' power in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College, and a provision that Congress would not be allowed to ban the Atlantic slave trade for 20 years. All of this is just an indication that when we commemorate the 250th anniversary of the revolution in South Carolina, we really need for it not to be a feel-good, self-congratulatory moment, but an opportunity to draw more people from all walks of life into some genuine historical thinking about these contradictions. Are there any questions at this point? We'll check the time.
Just one little. This map right here really just shows how big Africa truly is as compared to the other continents.
You know, that's a very good point. Just even, this comes up in my African history class as well and in other places, that even our traditions of map making that distort some of the areas of the land give us a skewed image of how the continents relate to each other. But this gives us a much better idea, you know, of the size of North America versus the size of Africa. You could fit the current United States along with Alaska and Hawaii, plus all of continental Europe, and throw in China. You could put them all in the African continent and have land left over. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Go ahead.
Why do you think that, like you talked about when we're talking about the slave trade, we're talking about it in like the triangle trade. Why do you think Barbados is left? Like, do you feel like that's purposeful? Do you feel like it's laziness? Do you feel like, where do you feel like that got ixnayed out?
Yeah. So French does a good job of kind of recounting some of the historiography, going back to Eric Williams, who was himself a colonized person from the Caribbean in the mid-20th century, who was the first one to begin to throw open this question of the role of the West Indies in the rise of the Industrial Revolution. So that happens in the mid-20th century, and as you can imagine, that theory takes a while to catch on, right? It's a black man from the West Indies who's the first person to point it out in that context, and other scholars come along, right? But there's also a lot of resistance to that. The real change in the scholarship comes in the 1960s and 70s, and there's a lot more scholarship that explores these connections, both from the kind of the political side, from the economic history, as well as sort of the cultural and intellectual changes that are taking place. And I guess where we are now is that the best of this scholarship very much needs to filter through into the general population. So the problem at this point is not the scholarship, right? The problem at this point is communication, right? The problem at this point is, what is our relationship with K through 12 teachers, right? And what is our relationship with museums, the other places that people get their history, and how do those kinds of stories get to change? So of course, I mean, you know me well enough, I'm gonna say that the real question is public history, right? It's not the academic history at this point, it's the public history connection that we gotta work on. Oh yeah. All right, so do we have time for the British World Order? Let's try, okay? So the British World Order, oh no, I wanted that to be a big reveal. Sorry, that was a little too early. Anyway, we're gonna let these people sit there for a minute. All right. So according to McCoy, the British World Order starts with the Congress of Vienna in 1815 that ends the Napoleonic Wars. And as we were just talking about, the cataclysm that led to the dissolution of the Iberian World Order and the emergence of the British version was this age of revolutions on both sides of the Atlantic. And the country that comes out as the clear victor in these age of revolutions and the Napoleonic Wars is Great Britain by a mile, economically, politically, and militarily. Their leading role in the slave trade, amid all this talk about liberty and equality in the age of revolutions, together with the loss of their North American colonies, left Britain with a kind of crisis of legitimacy. And so the new British Empire and the world order that it imposed in the 19th century made some improvements in these key areas of international relations and human rights. So in Europe, there's the idea of the balance of power, that no country should gain too much of an advantage over the others. And overseas, the British abandoned the idea of the closed imperial economic system in favor of free trade and freedom of the seas, which of course they are going to enforce with the world's most powerful navy. And in terms of human rights, the most significant turn is the British campaign to abolish the slave trade and then of slavery itself. And this is spurred in large part by public pressure from activist clergymen in Britain itself, and also from the actions of the enslaved and the formerly enslaved. Court cases and publications in Britain and America, uprisings aboard slave ships, and rebellions in the sugar plantations of the West Indies. So Britain banned the transatlantic slave trade by an act of parliament in 1807. It pressured the United States to do so in 1808. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, it secured an anti-slavery commitment from every one of the participants. They signed their names to it. In 1833, Britain abolished slavery in its Caribbean colonies, even though, to be sure, sugar was still enormously profitable. And the West Indian lobby in Parliament fought long and hard against abolition. Britain signed anti-trafficking treaties with European and Latin American and African states. For 80 years, it deployed the Royal Navy to suppress the illegal slave trade in the Atlantic and then in the Indian Ocean at considerable expense to British taxpayers. This anti-slavery campaign was the cornerstone of the British claim that they were on a civilizing mission. What the writer Rudyard Kipling later on infamously termed the white man's burden of lifting up lesser breeds without the law. And this points to the biggest contradiction in Britain's human rights legacy, and this is the slide. The Principal Types of Mankind from 1893. The British basically dropped the religious hierarchy between Christian and pagan that was at the heart of the Iberian world order's initial justification for African slavery. But they replaced it with another idea that had also been brewing, germinating for centuries: racial hierarchy. And this British idea of race, which was increasingly clothed in the mantle of science in the 19th century, was their justification for a whole litany of abuses that did not look all that different in practice from those of the Iberian age. Military seizures of territory, depriving states of their sovereignty and individuals of their civil rights, forcing colonized people into periods of forced labor in lieu of paying taxes. Now, the twin energy sources that fueled the Iberian world order were wind and muscle power, coerced muscle power. The new energy source for the British world order was coal. Coal to fire furnaces to make iron and steel, and coal to burn in steam engines. You know some of this story too, right? The first steam engines were developed in Britain about the time of the American Revolution, and it didn't take long before they made mobile versions of steam engines that could power riverboats and railroads and transatlantic ships, and then the Royal Navy's warships. And of critical importance to our story in South Carolina and the United States, steam engines powered by coal were quickly applied to cotton textile factories in Britain. Now, we don't have time to talk in any detail about the Industrial Revolution, but suffice it to say that during the 19th century, the cotton textile industry in Britain became the principal driver of the global economy. The way that the sugar plantation had been before, now it was the cotton textile factory. And the great like horrifying irony for the country that led the abolitionist movement is that this new wave of prosperity and global power was almost entirely dependent on cotton that was grown by enslaved workers in the southern United States. You already know the outline of this story, so I'll just remind you. In 1793, the industrialization of British cloth production is accelerating, and another invention comes along, the cotton gin, which made it much easier and faster to separate the seeds from the fibers of upland cotton or green seed cotton, the species that could grow well away from the coast in the middle and Piedmont regions of South Carolina. So virtually overnight, the plantation model spread across South Carolina, and the money-making potential was so great that there was enormous pressure to expel the large Native American societies that were in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi in order to open up new cotton lands, and then the vast territory beyond the Mississippi River that was purchased from France after Napoleon failed to reestablish slavery in Haiti. In other words, cotton meant that the social and political model of the South Carolina Low Country, which was the social and political model of Barbados, came to dominate the whole state by the first decade of the 19th century. Do you remember where we started out last time with the founding of South Carolina College for the, quote, good order and harmony of the whole community? In other words, so that the plantation owners' sons from the Low Country and from the middle of South Carolina and from the upcountry could all get the same education in Columbia and be socialized together. From South Carolina, this system spread westward to a whole new region that came to be called the Deep South or the Cotton South, that eventually stretched all the way to Texas. By the middle of the 19th century, the bodies of the enslaved were the single biggest capital investment in the United States. And slave-grown cotton was the country's single largest export, almost all of it to the textile factories of England. And we know that this is the deep contradiction, this contradiction between the global movement toward abolition and the extreme profitability, the centrality of the cotton plantation that resulted in the rebellion of the cotton-growing elites, with wealthy South Carolinians in the driver's seat, and the costliest war ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. Now, you're familiar with this story too, so I'll point out just a few things to put this in context. The first thing I want to share is that Black South Carolinians resisted the dehumanizing effects of slavery at every turn. They struggled to build communities, especially through kinship networks and religious congregations. The version of Christianity that they practiced in private, away from the gaze of whites, emphasized the equality of all people before God and the promise of deliverance. Not just deliverance in the next world, but in this world too. And they resisted in more overt ways too, through rebellion and plots of rebellion. There's especially the Denmark-Vesey plot in Charleston in 1822. Denmark-Vesey was a carpenter and a lay leader in the local African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. You know the name of that church today? Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston. Charleston Massacre of 2015. That's Denmark-Vesey's church. Vesey had used his lottery winnings to purchase his freedom. And apparently he led a plot to raid the arsenal in Charleston to kill as many white people as possible, free as many slaves as possible, and to gather everybody up and sail to the free Black Republic of Haiti. The plot was betrayed, and Vesey and dozens of others were executed, and the AME church was demolished. But the effects of this planned uprising were widespread and really were part of helping to spur even more abolitionist action in the North and in the South. And when the slaveholders tried to secede from the United States and war broke out, Black South Carolinians took every opportunity they had to flee to the Union lines and to enlist in the military, to crush the rebellion, and to crush slavery. Before the war was even over, in the area around Port Royal, where the Union established a foothold late in 1861, they started to remake South Carolina and the nation from the ground up with the full expectation and demand that they would be citizens. This is an image from a national magazine of the first South Carolina Volunteers celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. And then in March 1865, for example, when federal forces liberated Charleston, 10,000 African Americans, soldiers, tradesmen, women, school children took over the streets to boldly proclaim the birth of a new biracial republic, proudly marching with American flags and banners with messages such as free homes, free schools, one country, and one flag, and we can respect the purity of the ballot box. Y'all, if I really get to talking about Reconstruction, again, we will be here for 2 weeks, so for now, let me just recall that South Carolina's experiment with building a biracial democracy in the 1860s and 70s was arguably the longest, the most successful, and the hardest to kill of all the former rebel states. And I'll just share a few thoughts about some of the remarkable advancements in these years in the direction of equality and democracy and civil rights and prosperity. One place to start is the new state constitution, the Constitutional Convention that met in January 1868. The election to choose delegates to the Constitutional Convention was the first election ever in South Carolina that included black voters, as dramatized in this first image here entitled "The First Vote." And a majority of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were black. They drafted a document that was progressive in a number of ways. I'll just share a few things. The new Constitution of 1868 started with a detailed Declaration of Rights. It was not amendments afterwards. It was not the Bill of Rights. This was the first part of the Constitution of South Carolina that established political equality regardless of race. The new Constitution mandated the state's first ever public school system, specifying that every school, including public colleges and universities, should be open to students of any race. It made population alone, not a combination of population and wealth, the basis for representation in the legislature. It abolished property requirements for holding office. It granted more rights to women than ever before, including the right of divorce. It created comprehensive local government for South Carolina for the first time, in the form of counties that were governed by elected commissioners. It established a welfare program for the poor, the disabled, and the aged that was administered through the county governments. It was the first and only Constitution of South Carolina that was ever submitted to the voters of the state for ratification. And even though most white people boycotted the referendum in protest to try and tank the new Constitution, with 60% of the voting age population, black voters turned out at nearly 100% and passed the Constitution anyway. The new state legislature that was then created passed a civil rights law that provided for equal public accommodations. It reformed the tax system, created a land commission that was meant to give access to poor blacks and whites so they could have their own farms. And it invested in railroad construction and mining phosphates for fertilizer production. Black politics in this era was vibrant, based at the local level in church congregations and schools and Republican Party clubs called the Union Leagues that often overlapped with each other. Men and women would gather in these spaces to discuss issues, and I do mean women as well. Black women were front and center in all phases of politics except for the voting and the office holding, but no state in the Union had gone that far at this point. This is where people would get together to discuss labor contracts, to keep up with the news, including like reading newspapers aloud for people who were illiterate. They would identify candidates for office, they would conduct campaigns, and importantly, Black South Carolinians tended to see emancipation and Reconstruction in both political and religious terms. They called it the Day of Jubilo, the promised day when God would establish justice on earth. And their political mobilization, their social mobilization was so successful that it took years' worth of concerted efforts by conservative whites to suppress it, including legal measures to reduce black voting, stuffing ballot boxes, gerrymandering local, state, and congressional districts, mob violence and lynching, targeting black and white Republican office holders with smear campaigns, spurious investigations, intimidation and assassination, burning down black schools and churches, withholding tax payments, campaigns in the state and national press that accused the Reconstruction government of corruption, of quote-unquote Africanizing the state, and of socialism. In other words, taking the tax money of hardworking white people and distributing it to those who were unworthy in the form of public schools and so forth. And their motivation was to keep the black population in as near a condition to slavery as possible in order to keep the cotton from flowing from the field to the factory at discount rates. Y'all may be familiar with some of the notable anti-black violence that took place right in this neighborhood. There was mob violence and a wave of assassinations across the state during election season in 1876, when the Reconstruction government was on its last leg. This poster, attention, colored citizens, attention, is for a mass meeting in Columbia in response to the Hamburg massacre near Aiken. But at the same time, in 1876, right here in Effingham, near where South Florence High School is today, State Representative Alfred Rush was assassinated on his way home from a campaign meeting in Timmonsville. More than 20 years later, there's this new wave of anti-black violence in 1898. The postmaster of Lake City, Fraser Baker, was assassinated and the post office burned down twice. And the last biracial government in the state, and maybe in the whole region, not far from here in Georgetown County, lasted until 1900, when local white mobs and 2 units of state militia came to put it down. To zoom back out and conclude this portion of our analysis, the British world order, during which all of this is happening, came to an end in the first half of the 20th century with 2 world wars that were fundamentally about countering the imperial ambitions of Germany, both in Europe and overseas. These are familiar pieces of this story. You know that the First World War shook the ideologies of race and empire around the world, but the British Empire and those of its allies managed to survive the conflict and to temporarily stabilize themselves. But this was followed by the Great Depression and then the Second World War, when the Nazi regime attempted to conquer a new German racial empire to the east in Ukraine and neighboring lands. And after that even more devastating conflict, as hard as the British and the other remaining European imperial powers tried, they could not resist these rising anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia and the Pacific and the West Indies. There is plenty to say about how South Carolina fits into this. Let me just draw to a close. This period of cataclysm is fully experienced by South Carolinians. What I'll say here is that Black South Carolinians took full advantage of both conflicts and of responses to the Great Depression in between the 2 world wars to press for their own political and social and economic rights. And they articulated very clearly the connection between the fight for democracy and equality abroad with the need for profound social, economic, and political changes at home. So it should not come as a surprise that the state's first branches of the NAACP were founded during World War I in Charleston and Columbia in 1917, and followed by, in the next year, by branches in 6 more towns, including Florence. And these branches immediately got to work in campaigns to secure equal jobs and pay in defense industries, to equalize the pay of black teachers, to register black voters. I found a version of this poster. This is a World War I recruiting poster. It says, "Colored man is no slacker." I found a framed version of this in the home of an older Baha'i lady I went to visit in Pendleton years ago. And right next to it was a framed charter of the Anderson County branch of the NAACP, dated 1918, just to illustrate, how this political activism at home is related to international conditions. The efforts of these NAACP branches were so successful that during the 1920s in South Carolina, there was a concerted effort of violence and intimidation across the state, led by the FBI, the new Ku Klux Klan, local law enforcement, and white ministers to dismantle the NAACP. During the New Deal, there was a new wave of black and biracial organizing through the NAACP and labor unions that also met with violence and intimidation. But this time, the NAACP didn't fold. In fact, in response to the violent crackdown of a voting rights campaign in Greenville, a self-employed plumber and gifted organizer, Mr. Levi Bird from Sherrall here in the PD, organized the formation of a new statewide body, the South Carolina Conference of the NAACP in 1939, that really turned the NAACP into a mass movement during World War II. And that is where we'll pick up next time for our third and final installment of this whirlwind version of South Carolina in global history. We have a couple minutes left for a question or a comment if you've got more.
Do you believe that the past will repeat itself if, just in general? Because, just the attitude of modern day America, do you believe the past is kind of starting to repeat itself a little bit?
See, this is exactly why I wanted to share that discussion from Tim Snyder last time about the politics of inevitability and the politics of eternity, right? Of course, there are things that happen now that seem a lot like things that happened before, right? And there are always possibilities for things that are genuinely new, right? So I think part of the value of what we're doing here together is to be able to place our current moment in some kind of historical context so that we can avoid a couple of extremes, right? So that we can avoid these extremes of saying, well, history just repeats itself, or things are just going to unfold the way they do because nature just sort of pushes things forward and there's nothing for me to do about it, right? That's one extreme that gets us nowhere, right? Where that got us in the 1990s is finally September 11, 2001, and oh wait, there's still stuff happening in the world, right? We didn't win the Cold War, right? Life is way more complicated than that, right? And then there's this other extreme that Snyder talks about, right? The politics of eternity, which is, we're constantly victims, no matter what you do. The enemy is always at the gates, and so we end up buffeted by our passions, right? I think that both of those are recipes for disaster, really. And so I think what I'm focusing on is to try to get us to think of history as a liberatory practice, right? As ways to break out of both of those kind of limiting views. But to do that, we have to be practicing, as Snyder put it, right? We have to be practicing history, not mythology, not just like memory, right? But actual analysis of the past in a way that opens up possibilities. Does that sort of answer your question? But yes, are there things that are happening now that seem quite related to things that have happened in the past? Well, yes, of course there are, right? A lot of folks seem to repeat what they have learned from their ancestors without critically analyzing it. And here we are. But we're not all bound to